The war was over before I was born. That is what they told me. That is what every tutor, every admiral, every silver-tongued dignitary who ever pressed their forehead to the floor of my throne room had said with the easy confidence of people who consider history already settled. The Volcae collapse, the Great Silence, the ending of the Long Fire. Each civilization in our coalition had given the event its own name, as if naming a wound were the same thing as understanding how it healed. I was Princess Regent Elindra Vaz Thyron of the Thyron sovereignty, 26 cycles into my reign preparation, heir to a throne that had survived the war by hiding behind 17 layers of planetary shielding and a great deal of prayer. My mother had been queen during the final phase of the conflict. She had died 6 years ago, not of battle, but of the particular exhaustion that comes from governing a people who have watched their galaxy burn and are not sure it will ever be fully cool again. I had inherited her court, her throne, her enemies, and her unanswered questions. It was the last of these that woke me at third bell on the night I found the archive. I have always been the kind of person who cannot leave a locked door alone. My tutors called it recklessness. My mother called it hunger. I called it the thing that had kept me alive through 3 assassination attempts, 2 diplomatic crises, and 1 very uncomfortable week when the sovereignty's entire food distribution network collapsed because someone had introduced a logic parasite into the shipping AI. I was in the lower vaults of the Palace of Long Calculation, which is what the Thyron people call the sprawling administrative complex that houses both the throne and 17 generations of archived records, because I could not sleep, and because the vault archivist had let slip, 3 weeks prior, that there was a sealed section in Sublevel 9 that had not been opened since the war's end. He had said it in passing. He had not expected me to remember. He had clearly never met me. Sublevel 9 smelled of mineral coolant and old decisions. The lighting was low and amber, the kind designed to preserve physical media that no longer existed, a ghost protocol for a generation of records that had long since been digitized. My personal guard, Sentinel Varro, walked 3 paces behind me with the resigned expression of someone who has served a curious royal for 11 years and has learned that protests only slow things down. "Your Highness," Varro said, "the archivist mentioned the sealed section is under a Class 4 covenant lock." "It is," I agreed. "Those require a member of the ruling bloodline to open them." Fortunate then. I pressed my palm to the reader beside the heavy gray door at the corridor's end. The reader hummed. It scanned. It found the Vaz Thyron genome threaded through my cells like a signature written in blood, and the door opened. The room beyond was not large. It held 8 data pillars, each sealed in amber-tinted preservation resin, each labeled with a date stamp from the final 18 months of the Volcae War. And in the center of the room, resting on a plain display stand that had been installed with the specific intention of presenting something important, was a single physical file, real pressed membrane paper, the old way, irreproducible and unforgeable, sealed with my mother's personal crest. I stood still for a moment, which is not something I do often. Then I picked it up and began to read. My mother's handwriting was small and precise, the writing of a woman who had been trained to say much in little space. "Elindra," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have died before I had the courage to tell you myself. I am not proud of that, but some truths are easier to leave for posterity than to speak aloud to someone you love. The war did not end the way the histories say. We did not win, not through coalition strategy, not through the fleet actions at Volcae Prime, not through the Thyron sovereignty's diplomatic maneuvering. Those things happened. They mattered, but they were not sufficient. The Volcae were 3 weeks from cracking the last of our defensive nodes when the cascade happened. What caused the cascade? The simultaneous catastrophic failure of every Volcae command infrastructure, the collapse of their warlord network, the implosion of their hyperspace relay grid, was a single action: carried out by a single individual. That individual was not Thyron, not Coalition, not any species whose name appears in our Alliance records. He was human. His name was Sergeant Kaiden Verk, of what the humans call the Terran Expeditionary Corps. He acted without authorization from his own government, without support from any coalition fleet, and without any reasonable expectation of survival. He survived anyway. We sealed this information at war's end because the Coalition High Council determined that acknowledging human involvement, acknowledging that a single human soldier had accomplished what 40,000 coalition warships could not, would create a political imbalance that the peace could not survive. The Vorshan Accords required all signatory civilizations to present a unified front. Crediting a human with the decisive act would have elevated the Terran Compact to a tier of galactic standing we were not prepared to grant. So we erased him from the record. His debrief is in the data pillars behind you. His biological profile, his mission file, his last known location. He was stationed, at last report, at a human transit post called Outremer Station, on the edge of what they call the Boundary Reach. Elindra, I am ashamed of what we did. I am more ashamed that I lacked the courage to undo it. You are going to be a better queen than I was. Do what I could not. Your mother. I stood in that amber-lit room for a long time. Varro, behind me, said nothing. He had read enough of my silences to know this one required space, not words. Finally, I set my mother's letter down very carefully on the display stand, turned to face him, and said, "We are going to Outremer Station." He closed his eyes briefly. "Of course we are, Your Highness." "Pull the data from the pillars." "I want everything." "Yes, Your Highness." "And Varro, this doesn't go to the Council. Not yet." He opened his eyes. In 11 years, I had occasionally asked him to bend protocol. I had never asked him to break it. He looked at me for a long moment, reading something in my face that apparently satisfied him, and then he nodded once. "Not yet," he agreed. Part 2, the edge of everything. Outremer Station was smaller than I expected, and more alive than any place its size had a right to be. We came in on a civilian transit vessel, myself, Varro, and 2 of his most trusted subordinates, all of us in civilian clothes, the sovereignty's crest locked away in a shielded case in the cargo hold. The station orbited a dim orange star at the far trailing edge of human-controlled space. It was technically a refueling and repair depot, the kind of place that functioned as a waypoint for freight haulers, independent contractors, and the sort of travelers who had business at the edge of settled territory and preferred not to answer too many questions about what that business was. It was also, according to the data pillars, where Sergeant Kaiden Verk had requested permanent reassignment after the war. The Terran Expeditionary Corps had granted the request. His file noted this had been approved without question, which I found revealing. Soldiers who saved galaxies and were then told those saves had never happened presumably became difficult to manage in normal postings. The station's main concourse smelled of fuel compounds, fried protein, and something that the human vendors were selling from small carts that made the air smell unexpectedly warm and sweet. I had studied human sensory culture in preparation for the trip. I recognized the scent as what they called coffee, a bitter stimulant beverage that humans appeared to treat as something between a medication and a religion. I was trying very hard not to stare at everything. I had met humans before at diplomatic functions, coalition formal settings. They always arrived in their best clothes with their most practiced manners representing something. Here, they were just moving through their day, laughing too loudly, arguing cheerfully over cargo manifests, children running in patterns that seemed incomprehensible from any strategic standpoint, but which produced an excellent distribution of chaos across the concourse floor. They were shorter than most species in the coalition, softer looking. My people, the Thyran, were tall and angular, our biology shaped by the high-altitude cold of our homeworld, our bones denser than most species found comfortable to stand near. Humans looked fragile by comparison. They always did. That was the thing I had never been able to reconcile with the war records. His work assignment, Varro said quietly at my shoulder, reading from his handheld, is listed as Maintenance Crew, Level 7. Environmental Systems. He chose that deliberately, I said. It would keep him out of sight. It would keep him useful without being visible. I looked around the concourse. He didn't want to disappear, he wanted to work. There's a difference. Varro gave me a look that suggested he found this distinction less significant than I did. Do you want me to approach him first? No, I had thought about this on the transit. I want to find him myself. Level 7 of Outremer Station was the mechanical layer, the bones and organs of the place, the ducting and wiring and filtration arrays that kept 1,200 inhabitants breathing recycled air without noticing it was recycled. It was not a place that received visitors. The lighting was functional white. The corridors were narrow. Every surface had the honest grime of a space that existed to be maintained, not admired. I found him 40 minutes after I started looking, which was approximately 35 minutes longer than I had expected, and 5 minutes shorter than Varro's estimate. He was lying on his back, half inside an access panel in the ceiling of a secondary filtration corridor, one hand holding a diagnostic tool, and the other apparently braced against something internal to the system that was resisting whatever he was trying to do to it. All I could see from the corridor floor was his legs, his torso, and one side of his jaw, which was set with the particular expression of someone who has been arguing with a mechanical problem for a while and is determined to win. He was, by human standards, what I had learned their culture considered unremarkably built. Average height for a male of his species, lean rather than heavy, brown skin, dark hair longer than military standard, suggesting he had stopped caring about military standards some time ago. A scar along the left side of his jaw that the bioscan data had noted, and I recognized immediately. It matched a notation in his battle record, a fragment wound from the final approach to the Volkai relay station. The relay station he had destroyed alone. I stood in the corridor and looked at him and felt something I did not have an immediate name for. It was not what I had expected to feel. I had expected to feel the weight of injustice, the political calculus of a wrong that needed righting, the responsibility of a queen confronting her mother's failure. All of those things were present. But underneath them was something simpler and less convenient. He was real. That was the thing. He was an actual person lying in an actual ceiling fixing an actual ventilation problem, and the gap between that reality and what the data pillars said he had done was so enormous that I could not hold both things in my mind at once without feeling something vertiginous in my chest. The filtration system made a sound that suggested victory. "There you are," he said to the machine, with a satisfaction that was entirely genuine. He slid out of the access panel and sat up and saw me. He went still. Not startled, a startled person flinches. He simply stopped moving, the way something stops moving when it has recognized a variable it wasn't accounting for and is running a rapid assessment. His eyes, dark brown, slightly tired-looking, went from my face to my posture to the corridor behind me, and I watched him do it, watched the calculation happen. Then he relaxed, very deliberately, into the body language of a person who is merely a maintenance worker, meeting a stranger in a corridor where strangers did not usually appear. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was even. "You look a little lost." "I am not lost," I said. "I am looking for Sergeant Kaiden Verk." Something happened behind his eyes, not fear, something more complicated. "There's no one here by that rank," he said. "Haven't been military in 8 years." "I know," I said. "May I sit down? I've been walking for a while." He looked at me for a moment longer, then gestured at the corridor floor with the diagnostic tool. It's not exactly a throne room. No, I agreed, it isn't. I sat down on the corridor floor. After a moment, he sat across from me, back against the opposite wall, elbows on his knees, watching me with the careful attention of someone who has survived things by paying attention. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Elindra," I said. "I am the Princess Regent of the Thyran sovereignty." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a long way to come," he said finally, "for a maintenance corridor." "Yes," I said. "It is." Part 3, what was taken from him. I told him about the archive, about my mother's letter, about the sealed data pillars and the Class 4 Covenant lock, and the 18 months of records that the Coalition had buried under layers of classified designation so deep that even most of the High Council had forgotten they existed. I told him all of it, sitting on the floor of a Level 7 maintenance corridor on a station at the edge of everything, because he deserved to hear it without ceremony and without political framing, and because sitting on a throne to deliver this particular truth would have been obscene. He listened without interrupting. That was another thing I noticed about him. He listened the way someone listens, who has learned that interrupting costs more than it earns. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I know what they did," he said eventually. "I've known since 6 months after the war ended, when the orders came through reclassifying everything from the Cascade. They didn't even tell me in person. It came through on standard comms, a file update, mission reclassified, my debrief sealed, new designation, participating party, supplemental action, non-coalition, as if I'd been a piece of equipment that had performed a useful function and could now be filed." "I'm sorry," I said. He looked at me. "Are you sorry, or are you here to do something about it?" "Both," I said. "In the order they're required." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, a small recalibration. "What do you want, Princess Regent?" "To understand what happened," I said, "and then to make it right. The second part requires knowing the first." He was quiet for another moment. Then he set the diagnostic tool down on the floor beside him, leaned his head back against the wall, and looked at the ceiling. "You've read the mission file," he said. "You know the tactical structure." "I know what was in the data pillars. I know the timeline. I know the outcome." I paused. "I don't know why you did it. The mission file doesn't have that." He made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. "No," he said. "It wouldn't." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not continue. Then he said, "We had a forward observation post my unit about 4 light minutes off the Volkai relay station. Standard reconnaissance assignment. Watch, record, report back. We weren't supposed to engage, the order was explicit. The Coalition fleet was supposed to neutralize the relay station as part of the 7th wave action. They were 3 weeks out." "But the projections had changed," I said. I had read that part. "The Coalition analysts revised the estimated time to node crack to 16 days. "Yeah, 16 days. He said it flatly, which meant the relay station needed to be down in 14. Which the fleet couldn't do from 3 weeks out, and the Council wasn't going to authorize a new fleet movement, because they were worried about overextending the defensive line. So they were going to miss the window." "They were going to miss the window," he confirmed. "And I was sitting 4 light minutes away looking at the relay station, and I had a strike package, small, 2-person infiltration kit, designed for emergency extraction, and I had Corporal Ray Tanaka, who was the best electronic warfare specialist in the Expeditionary Corps, and I had 14 days. And you went." "And I went," he paused. "Tanaka volunteered. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't ordered. She saw the same math I did, and she made her own choice. The mission file lists her as participating party, supplemental action, non-coalition as well," I said. "She knows," he said it quietly. She's on Meridian Station, runs a software consultancy. We don't talk often, but we both know. I filed that away. 2 of them. That detail had been in the pillars, but I had not fully sat with it until now. The image of 2 people looking at an impossible situation and choosing to walk into it without orders, without support, without any expectation that anyone would know their names afterward. "How did you get through the outer defense grid?" I asked. "The mission file says the approach data is redacted." He looked at me sideways. "Still is, technically. I outranked the people who classified it." He considered this. Then he said, "Tanaka found a resonance gap in the grid scanning pattern, 31 seconds every 4 hours. The Volkai were cycling their grid on a predictable interval because they'd never had anyone get close enough to matter. We came in on one of the small cargo shuttles, civilian configuration, ran quiet on minimal power. We had to drift for about 20 minutes with no propulsion to avoid the mass sensor nets, just floating in the approach corridor of an active Volkai defensive installation." "In the dark," he said. "Yes. Tanaka spent the time calibrating her intrusion kit. I spent it looking at the star pattern." A pause. "I'm not sure which of us was handling it better." Despite everything, despite the weight of the injustice sitting in my chest like a stone, despite the political calculations already beginning to assemble themselves in the back of my mind, I felt the corner of my mouth move. "What happened once you were in?" He told me. He told me all of it, and I listened. And the maintenance corridor was very quiet around us. And the ventilation system he had just repaired hummed gently overhead, with the sound of air moving through ducts kept clean by someone who did not have his name in any history. It took an hour. By the end of it, I understood several things I had not understood before. The first was how the cascade had actually happened. Not the orbital strike the public records implied, but a precise and deeply elegant act of electronic sabotage, carried out by Tanaka while Verk ran interference through the station's physical security systems for 4 hours, fighting a running battle through corridors with 9 Volkai security units, alone, keeping them occupied long enough for the intrusion to complete. The second was what it had cost him. Not an injury, though there had been injury, the scar on his jaw was the minor one. But in the 7 years since, living with the knowledge that the thing he had done at the greatest personal risk of his life had been systematically erased from the record, because the civilizations it had saved found it politically inconvenient to acknowledge. The third thing I understood was that I was going to need to be very careful about what I said next. Because Kaiden Verk had built himself a quiet life on the station, a real one. He had his work and his corner of existence, and he had, as far as I could tell, made a deliberate peace with the fact that the galaxy would never know his name. And I was a princess regent with a political agenda, however noble, sitting on his corridor floor asking him to let me disrupt all of that. I needed to be honest about that. I owed him honesty. He had had enough taken from him by people who were less than honest. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to believe that I am not going to pressure you regardless of what you answer." He looked at me steadily. "All right. If I bring this forward, if I go to the Coalition High Council with the archive, with the data, with the full truth of what happened, your name goes back into the record. Your mission goes on record, officially, formally, in every history." I paused. "That changes your life here. You would not be able to stay anonymous." "I know," he said. "Is that something you want?" He was quiet for a long time. "I stopped wanting recognition 8 years ago," he said finally. "What I wanted was for it to have mattered, and it did matter. The war ended. People are alive. That's not nothing." "It's not," I agreed. "But," he stopped. "But," I said gently. He looked at his hands. "Tanaka has a daughter, born 4 years after the war. She's going to grow up in a galaxy that doesn't know her mother was the person who made it possible for her to exist, and I think about that sometimes." I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would add to that rather than diminish it. After a moment he said, "What does making it right look like to you?" Formal coalition recognition, your name's in the historical record, Tanaka's name, a formal acknowledgement from the High Council of what was done and why it was wrong. I paused. And an apology from the Thyran sovereignty specifically, because my mother was on the council when the decision was made, and that means it carries my name too. He looked at me. That last part isn't political strategy, I said. I want to be clear about that. It's not calculated. It's just true. I know, he said. How do you know? Because you're sitting on a level 7 maintenance floor, he said, and you look like someone who could be sitting on a throne. Part 4, what the record did not know. We talked for another 2 hours. I am not certain, in retrospect, exactly when the conversation shifted from what it needed to be, a princess regent obtaining information from a key historical source, to what it became. The transition was not dramatic. There was no moment I could point to afterward and say, that was when it changed. It was more like the way starlight shifts, gradually, and then all at once, and then you cannot remember what the sky looked like before. He asked me about the sovereignty, not the political structure, not the diplomatic positioning, not the things that officials asked about at functions, but what it was like to govern a people who were still, 8 years after the war's end, half afraid it would start again. I told him the truth, that it was the hardest thing I had ever tried to do, and that I was not certain I was doing it well, and that the part I struggled with most was that my people needed me to be certain even when I was not. He was quiet after that. My unit commander, he said, told me something before the Cascade mission. I'd gone to tell him what we were planning, not to ask permission. There wasn't time and the answer would have been no, but I wanted him to know, in case. What did he say? He said that certainty was a performance and that the performance was important, but the performance and the real thing were not the same thing, and I needed to know the difference. He paused. I think about that a lot. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He died in the 7th wave action, 17 days after the Cascade. He said it evenly, the evenness of a person who has had years to learn to say a difficult thing without drowning in it. He never knew it worked. I'm sorry, I said. He would have thought it was a reasonable trade, Verk said. He was that kind of person. And then, after a pause, I'm not always sure I agree with him. The honesty of that, the clean, undefended honesty of admitting ambivalence about the sacrifice of someone he had admired, did something to something in my chest that I chose not to examine too closely in the moment. I asked him what he missed about active service. He said the clarity, the way military problem-solving had a shape to it, edges you could find and work along. He missed the people more, though. The specific density of trust that formed between people who had been frightened together. I asked him what he liked about working maintenance on a transit station. He looked surprised by the question, and then he said, the systems were honest. When something was wrong, it said so. When you fixed it, it worked or it didn't. No politics, no accumulated debt of history, just a problem that either resolved or didn't. I understand that, I said. I didn't think you would, he said, not unkindly. Everything I govern has memory, I said. Every policy touches a previous policy. Every decision carries 12 generations of context. Sometimes I go into the lower mechanical levels of the palace just to watch the maintenance crews, because they are the only people in the building who are dealing with something that is only what it is. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before. Not the careful assessment of the first corridor encounter, not the guarded openness of the storytelling, something quieter and more present. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone with an agenda and a speech prepared. He paused. You have the agenda, but I don't think you prepared the speech. I had notes, I admitted. I didn't use them. He laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it briefly made him look considerably younger than the wary, weathered person who had slid out of an access panel 2 hours ago. No, he said, you didn't. Part 5, The Weight of Names. Varro found me eventually. He did not say anything embarrassing. He had 11 years of practice at finding me in improbable places and communicating only the information that was logistically necessary. What he communicated, via the extremely subtle signal system we had developed over a decade of navigating my habits, was that the transit departure window was approaching, and we needed to begin thinking about logistics. I stood up from the corridor floor, which after 3 hours had become surprisingly acceptable as a sitting surface, and looked down at Kaiden Verk, who had also stood, and I said, I need to ask you one more thing. Ask, he said. Will you come to Thyren, to the sovereignty? Not for the council, not yet. I want you to come first before any of that so I can show you what was built in the years since the war. What was possible because of what you did. I paused. I think you deserve to see it before you decide anything. He was quiet. That is also partly political, I said, because I am a politician and I cannot fully separate myself from that. But it is also true. Both things are true simultaneously. I have found that most true things work that way. He looked at me for a long moment with those dark, tired eyes that had seen more than they should have been required to see at the age the data pillars told me he was. You're going to do this regardless of whether I come, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I said, the archive exists, my mother's letter exists. I cannot close that vault and pretend I didn't open it, even if I wanted to. I held his gaze. I do not want to. And if I say no to coming, then I bring it forward without you, as carefully as I can, and I make sure Tanaka is consulted, and I do my best to ensure that what happens next serves you rather than erases you again. I paused. But I would rather you were in the room when history is corrected than read about it from a maintenance corridor. He looked at me for long enough that I started to genuinely prepare myself for a no. Then he said, all right. All right, you'll come. All right, I'll come. He picked up his diagnostic tool from the floor, looked at it for a moment, set it down on a nearby shelf. I'll need to arrange cover for my shift. Someone needs to finish the filtration array on sub-corridor F. I will personally ensure the Thyren sovereignty covers the cost of your replacement maintenance worker for however long you're gone, I said. He looked at me with an expression that was caught between disbelief and amusement. You're going to pay a maintenance sub because I said I'd come to your palace. I am going to pay a maintenance sub, I said, because the filtration array on sub-corridor F needs to be finished, and you take your responsibilities seriously, and I want you to take my invitation seriously too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 days to arrange things here. Can you wait 3 days? We can wait 3 days, I said. Part 6, Thyren and After. I had lived in the palace of long calculation my entire life, and I had never seen it the way I saw it when I walked through it beside Kaiden Verk. He looked at things the way a person looks at things when they are genuinely trying to understand them rather than simply experiencing them. He asked questions that nobody asked me, not about the politics or the history or the dynasty, but about how the heating systems worked in the older wings, and why the central atrium was built with that particular angle of skylight, and who maintained the external observation platforms and how often. I answered all of them. Some I had to look up, and he waited while I did, with the patience of someone who has learned that rushing good information produces worse information. On the second day, I took him to the memorial garden in the northern wing of the palace, the place my mother had built in the first year after the war to hold the names of the dead. It was a long room, low-ceilinged, lit from below by the blue-white light that the Thyren associated with stars rather than morning, and the walls were covered in names. 12 years of names, accumulated over the full length of the war. He stood in front of them for a long time without speaking. "There are human names here," I said quietly. "On the eastern wall. Not many, the human fleet contribution came in the final months. But they're here." He walked to the eastern wall and found them, and stood there for longer than he had stood anywhere. I stood beside him and did not speak. Finally, without looking away from the wall, he said, "There's a name here I recognize, Corporal Yuki Adami. She was in my sister unit, 3rd Expedition Group." "Tell me about her," I said. He did, and I listened the way I had learned to listen from him, completely, without preparing my response while he was still talking. "I brought the archive before the Coalition High Council 12 days after we arrived on Thyron. I had not consulted the council in advance. I had not sent the diplomatic communications that protocol required. I had been Princess Regent for 6 years, and I had learned that there were times when the normal sequence of official preparation created space for official obstruction, and this was not a moment I was willing to have obstructed. I walked into the council chamber with Varro on my left and Kaiden Verk on my right, carrying my mother's letter and a data transfer from the pillars, and I presented the full record of what had been done. The chamber was very quiet. There was the argument I had expected, the political instability concerns, the worry about Voakai Accord's complications, the concern that elevating human contribution retroactively would upset the established hierarchy of coalition influence. I had prepared for each of these. I answered them. What I had not prepared for was the moment when High Counselor Veen of the Vorshai Collective, an elder statesperson who had been on the council during the war, stood up from her seat, crossed the chamber floor, and bowed her head formally to Kaiden Verk in the Vorshai gesture of personal debt recognition, the deepest gesture her culture had. He stood very still. She said, in the formal Vorshai, "My grandchildren exist because of you. I have always known this, and I have lived for 12 years with the weight of not being able to say it to your face." He said something back quietly that I could not hear. She returned to her seat. Her expression was the expression of someone who has put down a weight they had been carrying a very long time. The formal recognition passed the council in 3 hours. It was not unanimous. It was never going to be unanimous, but it passed with sufficient votes to enter the record permanently. The historical revision would take months of formal process. The announcement would require careful management. None of that was going to be simple. When we walked out of the council chamber into the corridor, I said, "That was not how I expected that to go." "No," he agreed. "Counselor Veen." "I didn't know," he said. "She was just a council member to me. I didn't know she had grandchildren." "People are usually more than their official positions," I said. He looked at me sideways. "Is that something you tell yourself, or something you actually believe?" "Both," I said. "In the order required." He made the sound that was either a laugh or something adjacent to it. I was starting to be able to tell the difference. Epilogue, what honest things feel like. 3 months later, when the formal recognition ceremony was scheduled, and the announcement had been drafted, and the historical record was being amended in 17 languages across the Coalition database, I went to find him in the mechanical levels. He had been given quarters in the palace, at my insistence, and an advisory position on the Reconstruction Infrastructure Committee, which he had taken with the same considered practicality he seemed to bring to everything. He was not a political advisor. He made that clear immediately, but he knew engineering, and he knew what it felt like when systems failed people, and both of those things were useful. I found him in the sub-level of the palace, which was where I had half expected to find him, doing what appeared to be a voluntary inspection of the heating grid in the older wing. "Nobody asked you to do that," I said. "No," he agreed, from inside the access panel. "I noticed it was running inefficient." Of course you did. He slid out and sat up and looked at me. 3 months had done something to the wariness in his eyes. Not removed it exactly, because I suspected the wariness was structural, built into him by years of having good reasons for it, but overlaid it with something that was less guarded. "How are you?" I asked. "The ceremony is making me nervous," he said. "I know. I'm not good at being visible." "I know that too." I sat down on the sub-level floor, which had become, without either of us quite deciding it, a place where we had several times had conversations that were more honest than the conversations held in rooms with chairs. "Tanaka is confirmed. She's coming with her daughter." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said, in a voice that meant considerably more than the word. "After the ceremony," I said, "you don't have to stay in a visible role. The advisory position is permanent if you want it, but it doesn't require visibility. You can work on infrastructure assessment, the kind of work that happens in the engineering levels rather than the council rooms." He looked at me. "You're telling me I can go back to being in a maintenance corridor?" "I'm telling you," I said, "that you earn the right to choose what your life looks like. That is the part that was taken from you. The choice." I met his eyes. "The record is being corrected. But what matters after that is what you want, not what serves the story." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at me with the expression that was becoming familiar to me. The one that appeared when I had said something he had not expected and was taking it seriously rather than deflecting. "What do you want?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked me that directly. I said, "I want the sovereignty to be governed well. I want the people who kept the galaxy alive to have their names in the record. I want the memorial garden to have correct information on every wall." I paused. "And I want to keep having conversations on maintenance floors with someone who actually tells me the truth when I ask for it." The quiet in the sub-level was comfortable. That was the thing I noticed. It had shifted, over 3 months of deliberate and accidental proximity, from the watchful quiet of two people who did not know each other to something warmer and more settled. The quiet of people who have established a language between them. "I can probably arrange that," he said. "Good," I said. He looked at the access panel, then back at me. "If I'm going to be here long-term, the heating grid on sub-level 3 needs attention. Also, the atmospheric processing relay in the East Wing has a resonance gap in its cycle that I don't love." "I will authorize whatever you need," I said. "I don't need authorization. I need the parts." "I will authorize the parts." There's also a calibration issue in the central water recycling system that the official maintenance logs have noted but not addressed for 6 months. "Kaiden." "Yes. The systems will wait." He looked at me. "Will they?" "For 1 hour," I said. "Come with me, I want to show you something." "What?" "The skylight angle in the atrium," I said. "You asked about it on your first day. I found out the answer." He stood up, brushed off his hands, and looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one in a way that had become, over 3 months, something I found myself watching for. "You looked it up," he said. "You asked a good question," I said. "Good questions deserve answers." He fell into step beside me, and we walked up out of the sub-level into the palace above, where the light was golden and the memorial garden held true names on its walls, and the treaty rooms were already being prepared for a ceremony that would write 2 more names into the record where they had always belonged. It was not the story the histories would tell. The histories would have the council chamber, the formal recognition, the official language of wrongs acknowledged and records corrected. But this was the true version. A princess regent and a maintenance worker, walking through a palace that existed partly because of what he had done, toward a skylight whose angle she had looked up because he had been curious, carrying between them the specific and comfortable weight of honest things said in honest places. I thought my mother would have approved. I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I might be becoming the kind of queen she had hoped for. Not the certain kind, the honest kind. Which was, it turned out, what the work actually required. End. Word count, ~9, 820 words runtime, minutes at 160 WPM. Channel, Princess Queen Romance Channel. POV, first person past tense, Princess Regent Elindra. Film DNA, Global Meltdown 2017, Apocalyptic Stakes, Last Stand Energy, Civilization Saved by One Person's Desperate Act, Aftermath Discovery Framing. Tone, Dignified Romance, HFY Reverence, Political Weight, Earned Warmth.